Eight. Welcome to the second edition of the Spirals virtual seminar series. For the few of us who weren't here in the first session, I just want to make some housekeeping notifications. We are recording the session, and as our invited speaker, Tahani, mentioned, we uh, we keep this recording for purposes of documenting the event and do not circulate it in a raw format online. You're welcome to email us if you feel uncomfortable, or drop a message in the chat if you feel uncomfortable about being recorded, and we can negotiate with you about that. As to the format, very briefly, I will give a short introduction. My name is Dwayne Jethro. I'm the Junior Research Fellow. I'm the lead curator of the Spirals virtual seminar series, with the gracious and generous assistance of Nina Liebenberg, who is also in our session. I will give a short introduction and then introduce our guest speaker for today, Tahani Nadim from the Humboldt University Berlin and the Museum for Naturkunde Museum, the Naturkunde Museum in Berlin. This will be followed by questions by our discussant, Professor Fritha Langemann, and a response by our speaker, after which we will open up for questions from the audience. If I can ask, if you could please turn off your cameras during the staged sections of the seminar. So when our speakers are speaking and when the discussants are engaged, if you could turn off your cameras, that would be wonderful for managing data consumption, especially for those people who do not necessarily have access to that kind of data to cater for using their camera. So, circulating ideas about art practice and archival engagement of all kinds between Berlin and Cape Town, two dynamic yet also very different global north and global south settings. The Spiral virtual seminar series draws researchers, scholars, artists, and curators together into a conversation in a themed virtual format. The Nature's Archive and Anthropology Spirals talk, which is the theme of today's talk, asks, what is nature and where is the natural located in systems of classification and representation? We engage with the archival construction, representation, and incorporation of nature. We are interested in its ordering and systematization in books, museum collections, and databases, and seek to raise questions about the work of representational practices, translation, classification, and the archival construction of the natural world. What anthropological methods can be employed for interrogating data formations, which Tahani will speak about today, data formations of the natural world, but also what artistic methods can be developed for creatively engaging with, disrupting, or even reorganizing some of these structures. We are excited to host Professor Tahani Nadim of the Museum of Natural History Berlin and KAMA, the Center for Anthropological Research on Museums and Heritage at the Humboldt University, who will be presenting a talk, Data Formations, Legacies and Futures in Natural History. Professor Nadim is a junior professor of sociocultural anthropology at the Department for European Ethnology, in a joint appointment with the Humboldt University Berlin and the Museum of Natural History in Berlin. Her research is concerned with the structures and infrastructures of data collections and attendant practices, experiences, and orderings. During her time as an international museum fellow at the Museum for Naturkunde, she produced the exhibition Dead Wasps Fly Further, together with the visual artist Asa Sonia's daughter. A current research program, Data Natures at KAMA, establishes multi-sited ethnographic inquiries into the data practices in natural history museums. These include, but are not limited to various digitization efforts, as well as data-centered citizen science activities. Our discussant today is Associate Professor Fritha Langemann from the Michaelis School of Fine Art here at the University of Cape Town. Her research is of an interdisciplinary nature and her research interests include curatorship, scientific representation of the body, and the display and ordering of information. She has exhibited nationally and internationally and has a number of public commissioned works. Her exhibition Rat, which was also staged in the Museum of Natural History, the Ezekiel South African Museum, used a single species to comment on hierarchies of display and the iconography of evolution within these spaces. She has contributed to the West Coast Fossil Park Interpretive Center, and the most recent exhibition, Freighted, looked at 500 years of rhinoceros collection and display. So it's absolutely wonderful to have you all in audience today and to have this conversation as part of our series. It's a very strange time, both in the global north, where our semesters are starting, the lockdowns are locking in, and the cold seasons are arriving. And here in the global south, our semester is ending and we're moving into summer. It's a very interesting time, and it's a wonderful time just to have this conversation and to have you all in audience here today. So I'll gladly hand the floor over to you, Tani. Really looking forward to your talk. Thank you for coming in and speaking to us today.
Thank you, Dwayne. Give me a few moments so I can get my technical setup running. So you should be seeing my presentation now. If not, then I would ask Dwayne to shout.
I can see your presentation.
Wonderful, thanks. So thank you for having me. Thanks, Dwayne, for this kind introduction and for this even kinder invitation. I'm thrilled to be sharing some of the questions and problems that I have encountered in the course of my engagement with natural history and in the Natural History Museum Berlin to share these with you. And I'd like to begin with a concept or a figure that I'm currently working with and also wrestling with, namely that of data formations. But rather than define it from the outset, I'd like to show you what I wanted to do. So here you see the Museum of Natural History Berlin at the end of the 19th century, so shortly after it was opened. And I will return to this moment in a moment. And here you see the museum, or a version of the museum, yesterday on the Global Biodiversity Information Infrastructure called GBIF. GBIF is a publicly accessible database for species occurrence. So that's data about the presence of specific species in locations across the globe. This includes animals, plants, fungi, bacteria, viruses in their natural habitat, as well as in museum collections and tissue banks or biobanks. So if you look at occurrence data for the African bush elephant, you will find it among other places in Poland. Now, with the term data formation, I would like to understand the transformation occurring from this to this, as well as what Heidi Geismar so nicely calls the reality effects of the digitization and datafication of nature. GBIF is set to become the central digital portal for all natural history collections. And I think it's important to ask about the histories and the politics implicated and shored up in this transformation, in this development. So what I'd like to do is present you a partial history of the museum. Then I introduce some of the work that I've done, and then return to this figure of the data formation. And I'll have loads of images in the beginning, and then when I start talking about my work, or after that, I'll stop the images, and then you'll just see my face. Right. So you find the museum slightly north of the city center on Invalidenstraße, which literally means Invalids Street, pointing to its proximity to the Charité, which is one of Europe's biggest hospitals, university hospitals. It's also close to the seat of parliament, the seat of government. So you have parliament here, but it's also, the museum is also situated next to the Ministry for Transport and Infrastructure. And it is very close, as you can see here, railway lines, the main train station in Berlin. So I want to draw attention to this relational geography of the museum, because I want to really highlight that it's not a self-contained entity, despite of what this image might convey. And it's not just concerned with natural history, although we could say that natural history has never been just concerned with natural history. So the building, this is the building 2010. It opened in 1889, and you could see it as part of a larger development in the US and in Europe, which saw museums opening up to mass audiences for the first time. And it's also part of a development that saw museums gain a cultural standing and a kind of epistemic authority. The museum itself, however, was already established 80 years earlier in 1810, and as part of the newly founded Friedrich Wilhelms University, which is now the Humboldt University. The foundational stock of objects that that made up the museum in 1810 contained a huge variety, or a varied selection of objects, including specimens from cabinets of curiosity, including presents given to the emperor and the empress, it included special collections from private scholars, as well as specimens taken from colonized territories, including South America. So Alexander von Humboldt's expedition in South America from around 1800, specimens from British Guiana, from Australia, as well as South Africa. The first rector of the university, and from 1815 also the second director of the museum, was Martin Hinrich Lichtenstein, who had organized numerous collection expeditions. And here you see the cover and a section of the glossary of his 600 plus pages travel account, Travel in Southern Africa, combining taxonomic and ethnological descriptions as well as travel writing. And the glossary you see here contains entries such as, here you see flamingo, and then you see the Latin name, but here you also see flamingo. It says a bushman in General Jansen's service. You see an entry for flies, their volume and ways to exterminate them. An entry that says French refugees, fertility of individual locations. You see an entry for goose, as well as an entry for mountains. You see an entry for a king named Gaika, his mother, wives, and his meeting with General Jansen. You see, for example, thunder, another entry for giraffe, and church services of the missionaries. So this is just a sample page of the glossary. And what I want to stress here are three things. Firstly, as mentioned before, natural history has always been implicated with other domains. The collection of nature needs to be seen in a continuum with other practices, including the classification of people, governance and exploitation of territories, or even religious doctrine. Second point here concerns scientificity, and that the scientificity of natural history collections is something construed after the fact. There was nothing that would nowadays pass as scientific about the collections when the museum opened and beyond, even after that. And indeed, given that it contained presents to the emperor and curiosities from cabinets, we might argue that the scientificity was already contested in the early 19th century. And thirdly, and I'm sure this is something that you have great experience with, given that you have archives in your title, is that the tools and artifacts of information and data management, such as the glossary, they actively participate in the production of scientificity. And the glossary is of course only one example of the many material technologies that we use to order and record information at the museum. They standardize and rationalize the incoming stream of animals and plants and objects. So Liechtenstein's estate is at the museum, in the archives of the museum. And Liechtenstein was very concerned with creating informational practices in the museum to record specimens. And one of the practices he introduced was color coding specimens, the specimen labels, by continents. So by doing so, he also introduced a new system of global geographic provenances that is still in use today in the museum. So with the beginning of German colonization, the museum collections grew even bigger in volume and, as you can see, in dimensions. A directive of the Imperial Reichstag, so the Imperial Parliament, dictated that all natural specimens collected in colonized territories should first come to the museum in Berlin for processing, where appropriate, be distributed to other collections. By 1914, Germany had over 180 substantial natural history collections in museums. So with the volume of incoming specimens, the museum had to reorganize itself into smaller collections based on animal groups, birds, mammals, fish and reptiles, insects, amphibians, and so on. So this classification, as you probably know, was based on Linnaean taxonomy. And while some of the groups have been revised, they still serve to this day as the organizing unit for the museum collection. So they no longer constitute a group, vermis, worms. We still have a department for worms in the collections. So this, I think the reason for this, they are varied. Orders are materialized in collection furniture and architectures, as well as in the documenting technologies. You have very distinct epistemic cultures around animal groups. And of course, you have biographies and egos. So all conditions that make old orders extremely obdurate and traditional practices extremely enduring and hard to change. And I think, so this also makes the informational ecology extremely diverse. And so when we think back to GBIF and the database, we might now also be able to see the potential and the actual institutional upheavals that such a data infrastructure might occasion. So I'm bracketing out most of the 20th century in order to just give you a brief overview of what's happening in the museum right now. And maybe one thing that's worth mentioning is to say that the museum used to be in East Berlin. So that gives it a very specific history and also a very particular baseline for any further developments that happened in the 20th century. So coming to the museum now, this is a look into the exhibition. This is the museum's so-called biodiversity wall. And it's meant to stage a very spectacular and affective encounter with the diversity of life and its forms and colors and shapes. It contains, I think, about 3,000 species, and to me it represents it represents what I would argue is a shift from natural history to biodiversity science. So from nature to biodiversity, and in the last 10 years, the museum has very aggressively positioned itself as a research museum, building state-of-the-art laboratories where scientists work on questions to do with the limb development in salamanders, or the social networks of bats, or the impact of meteorite impacts. So, and I'm mentioning this because I think the shift from natural history to biodiversity science is also a shift to overcome the kind of frivolous history of the collection, perhaps, or the kind of randomness of the items that we find in the collections. And the biodiversity wall was a key object for me when I first came into the museum in 2013. I was interested in the term biodiversity. It had only been coined in the 1980s. And I wanted to learn how it was translated and negotiated in the museum and in different museum practices. Biodiversity was kind of invented to replace the term nature, to give it a more scientific connotation, so it could gain a specific efficacy or a balance vis-a-vis policy and governance. So and it did so, and again, this is my argument. So it did so because it made nature accountable in new ways. For example, we are seeing lots of developments around measuring biodiversity. Measuring biodiversity in a way that we could never really talk about in relation to nature. We have a global biodiversity index, for example. There's biodiversity thresholds and so on. And of course, data infrastructures like GBIF become central in these modeling and measuring exercises. But to remain briefly in this moment of my arrival in the museum, or of my early years in the museum. So one of the things I did back then in 2013 was take part in the taxonomic work that happened in the insect collection. So together with a PhD student, I described and I identified a set of wasps that had come from a biodiversity survey that was carried out by the University of Kentucky in northern Thailand. So this might seem a strange constellation, but this is very much how biodiversity surveys and these kind of expeditions still happen, where well-endowed institutions or researchers go out into the field, collect stuff, and then bring it back and then send it out to the respective taxonomic experts in different collections around the world. for identification. So I then I translated my field notes and my observations and also my concerns into a script for a theatrical tour that would take members of the public behind the scenes into the insect collection. And in the course of this tour, I metamorphed into a wasp myself. And this was one of 3 site-specific installations, part of a collaborative project that Duane has already mentioned in his introduction. A project that I did together with the visual artist, Åsa Sonjasdottir. The other 2 parts consisted of a film about dust projected in the mineralogical collection or the exhibition, and an installation on the museum's seed collection, which you can see in the foreground here, for which we also collated and exhibited different forms of documentation, lists, catalogs, inventories related to agricultural experiment stations in the German colonies. So now this is the moment where I stopped sharing my screen and conclude the images. And now you'll only see me. More generally, my research focus has been on data practices, on the ways in which people in natural history and biodiversity sciences collect, compose, cook, maintain, distribute data. And in relation to this, the museum at the moment finds itself in a really transformative state where, on one hand, the museum is looking to digitize its entire collection. So we're talking about 30 million objects. And it also has secured unprecedented funding for this. On the other hand, novel data-driven techniques and technologies are changing not just taxonomic routines and material infrastructures, see GBIF, but concepts of relation, of history, of nature. So this returns me to data formations. Heidi Geismer has nicely put it when she said the digital is the new analog. And I would say that the digitization of collections compels museums to face their ghosts. This becomes particularly urgent in relation to traceability and provenance, since they also remain key requirements for sustaining for ensuring sustainable access and findability and reuse. And so the history is embedded in the specimens, as well as in the artifacts used to record information. They need to be revisited and they need to be reckoned with. They need to be articulated. And these include, of course, also the history of acquisition and its attendant political and economic contexts, which have usually been excised from collection management concerns, as well as biodiversity sciences in general. And of course, I'm thinking here particularly of specimens and knowledge derived from colonial context, but this extends also to more recent relations to indigenous groups or to contested territories. So when we talk about opening up collections through digitization, we also need to consider how to open up our data models and data ontologies to account for the politics in data and the politics of data. And I want to suggest to think of data as data formation. I'm here inspired by Laura Stoller's notion of imperial formation for addressing the kind of the less visible, more persistent histories and human data mediations which saturate the datafication of nature. I think the term puts an emphasis on the processual nature of data as well as on its shifting context. digitization is never finished. And at the same time, it accounts for the situated and the very idiosyncratic data practices that we find in collections, and that vary not just between collections, but also within them. So yeah, I think data formations can complicate expectations and assumptions associated with data, and can also serve as a boundary concept to enter into dialogue with archival sciences, information sciences, and biodiversity sciences. So to conclude, just to say where I find myself now. So in 2017, I founded, together with my colleagues Ina Heumann, who is a historian of science, and Anita Hermannstetter, who is a museum expert, the Department Humanities of Nature. And we founded this to consider the politics of nature and of collecting nature. And with our work, we want to show how natural history and its institutions, past and present, have always contributed not only to knowledge about nature, but have also contributed to social and political orders and cultural formations. The department has become a very lively place for interdisciplinary exchange and experimentation. We've recently hosted a poet. We currently have a visual artist as a guest scientist. My colleague Anita ran a 3-year art science program. And my colleague Ina has published one of the most talked about museum-related books in Germany, which reconstructed the colonial history of the dinosaurs that you saw in one of the slides. So I say all this because this is also an invitation I want to extend to you, because we'd obviously be super thrilled if this could be the start of a longer dialogue with you. So thanks.
Awesome, thank you so much for that really rich presentation, Tahani. There were so many points of interest and so many points of contact. I'm really fascinated by your idea of data formations. Of course, the title of my book is Heritage Formation, so I also think about this idea of formation, of processes of bringing into being, and what happens through that constructive process, and what drives those kinds of constructive processes. I was also struck by your observations about yeah, your quote, you quoting Heidi Geismar's "the digital is the new analog," and your speculations about your critical speculations about the digitization process that not only the Natural History Museum is embarking upon, but also other major museum institutions in Germany, Berlin. Like, so much money is being poured into these digitization projects, as if with a working assumption that digitization will solve problems of provenance, like it will solve this provenance problem. We just make our archives accessible online, and then we will have resolved this problem of provenance. When I'm thinking to some of the digitization projects that have been pursued in South Africa, not only at the Center for Curating the Archive. I mean, we've been doing digitization work for almost 20 years now. Archive and Public Culture, which is also based here at the University of Cape Town, also engaged in questions of rethinking digitization projects. It's also driving questions of, okay, so we have to start decolonizing metadata. It's in the very metadata, as well as the software that we use that produce and reproduce the problems of classification that we're struggling with today. So digitization isn't just a panacea. So yeah, wonderful, really generative, sparking all kinds of wonderful tangents and ideas. But I do not want to steal the floor. Fritha, I know that you and Fritha have had some conversation beforehand, which is also super generative, and hopefully we can pick some of these points up. Trissa, I'll hand over the floor to you.
Thanks, Dwayne. Yeah, I mean, there are lots of points of contact between the things that we're interested in and some of the points that you brought up in your discussion. Thank you very much, John. What I find so interesting is the positions that we both find ourselves in, and from where you are working, I suppose, and that in the museum in which you work, that there's been, as I said this to you before, there's been recognition of the need for humanities and the role that humanities plays in relation to the collections of science in that museum, and that Dwayne's term that he used in his introduction, I think, of disciplinary disobedience in relation to this, how one can work as an insider in some way, but need surface deep alternative reflections on those collections. And in my position, it's been very different working as a fine artist from outside the museum and bringing projects to the museum, not working from the inside. And so I found it interesting when we were talking about artworks and art interventions in museums, art installations, art interventions, how you sort of reacted towards the term of intervention in some way, and having some second thoughts about what that means. And it interested me because we use it so freely, this idea of we're creating an intervention in a different space that is not our space. But what does it really mean to do that, I suppose? And coming in from the outside and disrupting that space, turning things upside down as a strategy for rethinking collections, and how effective is that really? And then you mentioned Anna Singh's art of noticing as a different way of working with, way of seeing artistic, I don't know what the other word is, if we don't use interventions within museum spaces. And it made me think about how one might compare the art of noticing the small gestures that make audiences look at things very carefully rather than sort of the big intervention gesture. And also thought that looking at the two images that you showed of the wasp fly further, and the one being people looking very carefully in different spaces into those collections from the outside. And then the other image, which had the big yellow curtains, which sort of announced itself as an intervention in some way, in the way in which it is shown, and the different ways in which that can happen. So the art of noticing being something that is not progressive, but stops you in your tracks, sort of arrests that development and makes you see your environment carefully. How might we think about these interventions in different sorts of ways to be taking care, and all that language of caretaking that comes into seeing in other people's work as well. And one of the, so I think it's about a subtlety, but the alternative to that is also about sort of adding complexity, I suppose, in how we are stopped and made to think about things in different ways. And that's been one of my strategies that I used in one of my exhibitions, Subtle Thresholds, which was very hard to read. There was a lot going on. There were all sorts of cross-referencing of images, which, and because it, through the audience, I suppose, stopped that progressive development across the space. And yet, I'm not sure that it was in line with Singh's art of noticing either. So it's made me think about how we might think about that. One of my PhD students is working on relational practice as a way of understanding multi-species assemblages, and how one might, in a way of stopping by having conversations. So sort of a conversation through an object that is almost impenetrable. How we surface ideas about thinking around our relationship to other animals, non-human animals, through conversation and through the unknown. And maybe that's more aligned to Singh's art of noticing. Anyway, but maybe that's something we can, I think there are quite a few people here who work on the group who work with art and exhibitions, and Nina might have some ideas around that too later on. Then I'm interested in objects in the collections, and how specimens, I suppose, change their, well, we know they change what they are in their ontology. When they come into the collection, they're no longer living specimens, they become something else. But when they become part of a data set, what happens to them then as they become even further decontextualized? I think it's one of your phrases that specimens are already an index of absences, which I think is a very nice way of thinking about that. But I wonder how they are further disembodied by becoming part of a data set, and how might they be imagined as becoming somatic again. Maybe this doesn't matter, but to me, the idea of an animal becoming a living, present, empathetic object in our lived space relates to the way in which we might see specimens in the museum space as well, and in the collection space. So, and one way of doing that, of course, is through biographies, imagined or real. And you picked up on this now, in saying, understanding where the provenance and the histories of where these specimens came from, and often in very complicated ways. But I think that is a way of expanding the way in which we understand objects. And again, then this relates to some of the exhibitions that I've done, and to my rat exhibition, which wanting to draw attention to the poor rat that's been sort of marginalized, I suppose, by surfacing multiple stories and biographies around those rats. Also, my current exhibition, Rhino, which is a traveling exhibition in a crate, it brings up multiple stories about the histories of rhinos in museums over 500 years too. So that the role of that biography has to play in bringing the soma back into the specimen, I think is something to consider. Yeah, and so, but the question of, I suppose, how do specimens become further disembodied and turned into sets of the unseen copies of the unseen original. I suppose that also relates to my own interest, and in my Rhino exhibition, where I was looking at Dürer's print and his idea of abconfate, the copy of an unseen original, how we, the Rhino was never seen, and he had it, he drew it based on proxy conversations. But how our sense of the natural world, or the biodiverse world, if we don't use the word natural, first that it's disintegrating around us, I suppose, that there's mass extinctions, and we can become increasingly reliant on these disembodied bits of data to understand that natural world around us. So it becomes a proxy. Yeah, and I'm interested in your interest in the language of data, sort of neo-colonial politics of data that's around the language, and the standardization, expansion, assimilation, discrimination, and how these terms sort of recapitulate what we know from sort of colonial imperial past, and how we can avoid that in how we both, I suppose, the data is utilized, used, and the iconographies and assumptions that come with the language embedded within it. I'm also interested in that, the language of science and how it plays out in museum display, the linearities of the tree, the binaries of the book, and how that replicates the tree of life in the museum and reinforces the idea of linear hierarchies, progressive hierarchies, which has been my interest, and how the web of life provides an alternative iconography to that. And I looked at ways in which one might find display methods which picked up on that web. But I'm just wondering if data and sort of big data becomes the language of understanding life and biodiversity in those terms, how can we reimagine displays that sort of don't reinforce sort of global massings of wealth? Yeah, a few other things, but I'll leave it at that for now. Okay.
Wonderful, thanks, Fritha. Tani, do you want to take like maybe 10 minutes or so to respond to some of the questions that Fritha raised? Some really rich and interesting questions, and so many parallels and crossovers between the two of your work. And so I'm really curious to hear some of the responses.
Yes, thank you, Fritha, for your very considerate comments. Maybe I'll just concentrate on two things, because I don't want to hog the floor. I would be very happy to hear from other people. So on your reflection regarding intervention, and we had spoken about this prior to this meeting, and my discomfort with the word intervention or with the designation intervention. So I think to me, intervention is not the right term, or I don't want to think in relation to, in terms of intervention, because I think I think intervention sort of brackets out my own implication in the whole enterprise. So you mentioned this this difficult negotiation between inside and outside, and I totally feel that. The museum is my institutional home, but it's also my field, and so it's a complex, not necessarily always healthy balance between insider and outsider that I have to accomplish, and so intervention to me, it's too much of a kind of hygienic distance, and it's not. I'm totally in it, in ways that I find often extremely uncomfortable. I'm also more interested in, or another term that I find more useful for me is a term that was coined by Helen Varan, who speaks of generative critique, which is a kind of critique that is generative for everyone involved. So that includes the taxonomists in the museum, that includes my colleagues from the history of sciences, that includes everyone that finds themselves in these sticky and complex entanglements with the collections and with the objects. And then also what you mentioned about time, I think an intervention, what I also have a problem with is the, and I'm not saying don't do interventions, I'm just saying that this is, for me, it's not the vehicle. I think that it implies a specific temporality, and to what I experienced with working with Åsa Sonjasdotter on the exhibition, we had so much time, or we took the time, we took a year to really to talk with people, to revisit collections, to spend days in the library. And we experienced this moment. Of course, you come into these collections for the first time and you're bedazzled. And then you have ideas, but then you have time to really problematize your bedazzlement. And then you start factoring that into your response. And so it was just, I mean, of course, it's a super luxury also to have this time. But it's also important, I think, for generative critique, to really also, this is one of our aims with Humanities of Nature, to change institutional practices. You need time. Your other points around the object and the way in which the transformation from living being to museum specimen to data set. So one of the things that also inspired the exhibition, inspired the title "Dead Wasps Fly Further" was the fact that just the mobility of these specimens once they are in the museum, and the very lively loan traffic that happens across natural history collections, which is actually something that maybe ethnological collections can also learn from. To me, it signaled, or to me, it showed how these objects are still can still be activated, and a dead wasp travels more kilometers than a living wasp would ever do. And I'm not saying that, I don't want to say that the capacities are in any way equivalent, or that they should be glad that they're dead in a museum collection. But that we should also investigate the ways in which these transformations into data sets or into data points might prompt new kinds of relations and new kinds of mobilities that that are not that we shouldn't dismiss them automatically as something that we don't want. Maybe put it that way. Yeah, and what's also interesting to see is the way in which the object becomes not a tenable category anymore in the digitization. So you take a little bug, and out of this little bug, you have 5 different or 6 different versions of the bug, because you take a tissue sample and then that's placed somewhere else. You take you take a genetic sequence and that travels elsewhere, and you have the digital photograph and that finds itself in a video game or something. So the question is where does the objects end? And I think these sort of fundamental questions are thrown up by digitization that really can tell us something about the insufficiency of the ontology that we are wedded to.
Thanks, Tanya. I like the final phrase that you left us with, this idea of the insufficiency of the ontologies that we are wedded to, and the unstated assumptions that cloud around the possibilities of digitization as fulfilling all kinds of promises that ultimately this kind of project does not necessarily lead to keeping. It's an interesting transaction that goes on there. Digitization is a very interesting representational practice, so compelling, as natural as the natural objects that are classified and incorporated into these collections. It's so intuitive. So I found that really interesting. So I want to open up for questions now from our audience. I would like to invite you to switch your cameras on so that we can see you. You're a small group, and so it's more of a small group seminar type of environment. So if you can get some conversation going, that would be absolutely wonderful. So please feel free to switch your cameras on and to pose questions. I see Pippa has a question. Pippa, would you like to switch your camera on and pose your question in the session?
Sorry, I was just working how to turn my sound on. Thank you so much for that really fascinating presentation, and Fritha too for your response. And you know, I was thinking a lot about the several visits I made to the Natural History Museum in Berlin in 2014, and I think again in 2017. And of course, because Fritha and I are colleagues, we've had a lot of discussion around natural history in museums, and I think what Fritha maybe didn't make clear in her presentation was how some of her own, what she calls interventions, have kind of grappled with the qualities of wonder that the Natural History Museum seems to have at its very heart. So, you know, when you look at that wall you showed in your first slide, and you look at this extraordinary diversity of life, one is filled with this sense of wonder and awe. And I think what Fritha managed to do in one of her so-called interventions, which was the rat exhibition, was to completely undermine the sense of wonder with a creature that really has very little wonder in terms of our own apprehension of the rat. And then to think of it as it's, you know, as somewhere, I think she mentioned, you know, nowhere, anywhere in the world, virtually, are you less than 10 meters away from a rat. And disperse the rat throughout the museum. So there was almost not a single floor or space in that Natural History Museum where you didn't find a bit of Fritha's exhibit. And the effect was to inform and to intrigue, but also in a sense to undermine, because that action of experiencing awe and wonder was interrupted every time you encountered the historicization of one of the objects, which was the rat object. And when I was thinking of the Natural History Museum in Berlin, obviously one of the things I was most struck with, as many people are, is the wet room, where you know, there are many bottled specimens of sea creatures and so on, other things in those bottled specimens. And that room has the effect, again, of diverting the attention away from the wonder of the creature that's been shown to us and focusing it on the practices that it's been, you know, those animals have been assembled in order to facilitate. So the experience of the wet room is an experience of thinking about the ways in which science has assembled and manipulates and works with those collections rather than the actual objects themselves. And I found that an incredibly powerful display in the museum. And then the other thing I found quite powerful was a completely inadvertent display. Was if you wander up the stairs to parts of the museum that are shut down, and you peep through, and there were sort of rooms of almost mausoleums of ostriches and other specimens in cases and so on. And I was slightly disappointed to realize these were inadvertent displays. It was basically sort of open storage, because I thought, you know, very little needed to take place in order to express something of the, you know, the quality of the mausoleum that a natural history museum is. And it reminded me in a way of some of the, you know, the stories one reads around Wallace collecting birds of paradise, for instance, where he gazes upon them and thinks how wonderful it is. Everybody in the world should see these specimens, these birds, I must bring them back as specimens. But at the same time, decrying the fact that the very action of doing that is going to threaten their existence. And of course, he was right. And I thought there were wonderful opportunities in the museum to demonstrate that, or to expose, you know, to express that in what I think Fritha would call a kind of intervention, something that's almost, you know, a squatter exhibition, or an informal settlement exhibition in the museum to disrupt the feelings of comfort that the displays normally present us with. There are lots of other things, but I'll leave it at that.
Thanks, Pippa. I like your comment on this idea of the spectacular, the curation of the spectacular of natural life, and how natural history museums have to do that. I'm thinking about the whale display in the Ezekiel Museum. Coming to this hall, you have this the whale in the center. So it's about the sense of spectacular. And that opens up possibilities for thinking about these representational practices, right? Around how and in what ways artists can actually come in and engage in interventions. We've been toying with this idea of interventions, and around and with and against, especially the representational practices that natural history museums themselves mobilize for educating the public about natural history collections and nature and natural sciences. So is there anyone else with a question? If there are no questions, I'm going to start calling people out. Testing your
Dwayne,
knowledge.
can I just briefly, because people mention it, and just for people to get a sense of what people was talking about, maybe I share an image of the wet collection just so you can.
Yeah, please go ahead.
Can you see that?
Yeah.
All right. So this is the wet collection, which was opened in 2007, I think. So this is a model for exhibitions, which is exactly what people was saying, that you kind of shift the spectacular is no longer the object, or the wonder isn't in the object, or isn't just in the object, but is in the practices of the museum. And I think it's an interesting question that this raises, namely what happens when you displace the wonder away from the object and onto institutional practices. And I think it's a political question, because it's a question of what becomes accountable and how, and what are the kind of what are the kind of vulnerabilities that this allows or doesn't allow. But I'll stop sharing this now. Okay.
Thanks, Ani. I see Nina Liebenberg has a hand up. Nina, you want to pose a question?
Yeah, I don't know if anybody wants to respond to Tahani first in terms of what she's raised. So mine is a bit removed from kind of the conversation that she's continued. So if anybody wants to do that first. Otherwise, my question or just observation really was is in connection with GBIF, which I didn't know existed, and it seemed really interesting for me the way that you're able to allocate different types of species, be it live ones walking around in the Kruger National Park, or it's an elephant walking around the Kruger National Park, or it's an elephant that's situated in a natural history museum somewhere else in the world. Is that correct? You can just nod your head if that's which is it's a very weird idea for me, and it made me think of, I mean, I would love to know the other. I think you also listed another category that was also part of what made these dots appear. So it's either live or museum. It made me think of the exhibition, the Nanook Flat Out and Bluesome. I'm not sure if you're probably aware of it, and I'll just give a short synopsis of it for those of you who don't know it. I think it's Mark Wilson and Brynnes, and then it's a very hard to pronounce surname, Icelandic surname as far as I remember. And it's these two artists that wanted to allocate all the polar bear specimens, the taxidermied polar bear specimens that were situated in the UK, I think. So be it in natural history museums or either in private collections. And that was, they staged their project in different ways. And I think the first part was just allocating all these bears. Second part was, and that's going to the provenance of the museum accession records, and I don't know where they found all the extra information. They didn't have GBIF at that stage, I think. And the second stage was bringing those specimens actually back into a natural history museum or into an exhibition space where you actually saw all these bears together. And what that resulted in was actually then highlighting how taxidermy processes work and how the bears are always stuffed in ways that make them look really, as if they're very ferocious and about to attack. And then, there was one specimen that had a really poignant taxidermied stance of just, looking at a paw that was just raised. So I don't really know what I'm saying. I'm basically just probably thinking through how these data and the data formations and the changes of them, you know, it is highlighting, you know, different aspects of the history of Naturalist Museum. And I mean, I can just say that I definitely saw that, for instance, in that type of museum or that type of artistic project where it brought those specimens back into the space, and I highlighted quite a few things about the history of these specimens in these spaces. But that's that.
Thanks, Nina. Yeah, to clarify, it's so it's GBIF contains when you look for the location of specific species, it tells you on the map locations where these species are in the wild, have been found in the wild, or have been humanly observed. Then museum collections and tissue collections. So of course it's interesting to maybe expand this and say, all right, if human observation counts, then what if I see an elephant on my screen? Can I input this on GBIF and kind of play with these databases in a way that kind of not necessarily take them ad absurdum, because it does follow on from a logic that's already in the system, if you see what I mean. And this is also my interest in denaturalizing this extremely sober interface that presents itself as a as an objective tool of science, and as a cogent, standardized data repository, when in fact it's as provincial as the collections where their data derives from.
I see that there are no other hands or questions. I see Chris Wingfield has his hand up. Chris, do you want to pose your question?
Yeah, thank you, Dwayne. I mean, I was interested in the kind of happening around this term intervention, which I thought was really interesting. And I mean, having kind of worked as a curator in museum settings, I mean, I'm aware that sometimes curators like to engage artists to say the things that they don't feel they can say. And so there's this sort of curatorial ventriloquism about inviting an intervention sometimes, that it can surface things that, you know, you may feel, but there's an institutional. And I guess I wondered about your position and the fact that you talked about when you started at the museum, but now, you know, you Tahani, you're kind of situated in that museum and you've created this new department, which I thought was, you know, was really interesting, of humanities of nature. And I wondered, you know, is that in your experience, is that a kind of positional change in terms of whether you feel like you're making an intervention or whether you feel like you're actually part of that institution, and therefore kind of engaged in more of an ongoing responsibility or conversation with that? And I thought that was really interesting. And I mean, I'm a big fan of the WASP piece. But again, I kind of wondered, you know, by adopting a different persona, does that create a different relationship? So I think there's something really interesting about, you know, your positionality now as being embedded in a long term in the institution. So yeah, I mean, I'm just kind of an invitation to reflect more on that whole terminology around interventions and what you're doing and how you understand your role.
Thank you, Chris. It's a debate that I have with myself all the time. I still see my role as making good trouble, because this is also why they hired me, right? So they knew what they were getting themselves into. At the same time, I am concerned with acting more carefully in relation to my colleagues, and in the kind of collaborations with colleagues, not just in my department but across the departments in the museum. So where I choose my moments carefully, and distribute the kind of level and form of troubles that I raise on an appropriate level for the various moments. And I'm still learning this, but at the same time, I can also see that when done rightly, it is very much appreciated, because it is about sorry. Bringing in different perspectives, to put it very mildly.
Thanks, Tani. That was a really interesting observation, this idea of variegated distribution of troubles, like knowing what degree of trouble you need to make at what level of the institution and at what time. You can't just bring all the trouble, you have to bring little bits of trouble in the right places at the right times in order to facilitate incremental change. I was thinking about Anat Singh, because you introduced Anat Singh and Anat Singh's arts of noticing into the conversation, at least in our conversation on email. And I thought some of the observations that Anna was making are also relevant for thinking about the kind of work that you're doing at the moment in the Natural History Museum. You have this department in the museum, and if we can take one or two steps back, can you say a little bit more in very practical, logistical terms, like, so what kind of work are you actually engaging in with your colleagues in the museum? Like, what does your department actually do, and how does it function in this institution? And then, as a way of explaining the kind of, Anna speaks about slow seminars, right? Like slow learning. So what kind of slow interventions, not interventions, slow kinds of changes are you working on through your placement in the institute?
So I give you a very humble example, and then I give you a very high level example. Right. So the humble example is that I, for example, participate in the bi-weekly meetings of the information science group in the museum, where they meet every 2 weeks and they present certain technologies or certain practices or certain techniques that are relevant to them at this particular moment. So the last talk was by the new curator for our tissue collection, and he was talking about the problem of what I was saying about this the exploding specimen. The exploding specimen in relation to suddenly there being 5 parts to a specimen, and the problem of keeping connections, and the problem of how do you issue ID numbers, and how do you make sure that the ID numbers refer to each other. So I participate in these presentations, and I always try and ask questions that are slightly coming from the left field. And so that's a very humble way of voicing our concerns within the wider institutional context. A more high-level project is currently undertaken by my colleague Katja Kaiser, who is a provenance researcher, and she's drawing up a white paper to do with guidelines for dealing with natural history collections from colonial contexts. So just to give you the breadth of works that are carried out in the department. I can list many more examples, but just to give you an idea of the kinds of works that are happening.
No, that's absolutely wonderful. I mean, there's a whole conversation that we can have about about the colonial legacies that are entangled in the Natural History Museum, and the way the museum is actually addressing, but also struggling with these entanglements. Sometimes, yeah, like really struggling with getting to grips with the fact that many of the samples in the collections have colonial provenance, and what that actually means, and how they have to address it. So there's a whole sub discussion that we can have, and I think that's a really important area of work that you're doing. And it was great the observations that you made about sitting in the seminars and engaging in the practical work that the curators are doing, because I guess with constant questioning, slowly, hopefully, you can shift institutional practice even just a little bit, and I guess that's a success, so to say. Do we have any other questions? Are there anyone else want to pose a question or comment? George, in our previous conversation, we were talking about interventions, and Chris raised this very interesting phrase, introduced it into our discussion now. Curatorial ventriloquism. Can we quote you, Chris? Yeah, curatorial ventriloquism, the idea that curators and artists are brought in to ask and make the provocations that employees in these institutions are not enabled to make. George, you also had a set of points about this when we had our discussion with Tao in the first session.
Yeah, I mean, I see the links, but I think for me at the moment, I'm still stuck and excited by the making different levels of trouble, which for me takes that question of ventriloquism in a different direction. So for today, I think I'm going to refrain from causing trouble and taking the lead to think about how one can actually push this idea and how this idea solves the problem of ventriloquism, because most of the time the ventriloquism depends on artists not being measured. And it's an invitation to think more deeply about artists that are being measured, because, as you know, for me, I don't think artists are going to stop engaging these type of activities or finding themselves in these situations. But I think we're going to find more artists that are going to be adopting the model that Tahini has just put. Wait, did I pronounce it right?
Tahani.
Tahani, yes, that you've put on the table. So for me, I think that's something that's interesting for me. And then the other part that's a bit problematic for me is I always find myself, when you're talking about a colleague that's thinking about the exploding specimen, is, why I always end up troubling this thing of like, why do we want to invest so much money in the culture of cataloging? I understand why, if it's if the space is what it's meant to do, that's the job. But I think that needs to be troubled a whole lot more. And I don't know how one would do that. But yeah, I think I'll stick to pondering more about how to join you in that department of measure.
Thanks, George. That's more than enough trouble for us this afternoon. I just thought it was really important to bring you in on this this particular line of conversation, because it was an issue that came up in our previous session also, and I think it will be an ongoing theme. Questions of the role of the artist in big institutions. What are their roles? What is their job? What is an intervention? That being said, however, the kind of work that you're doing at the Natural History Museum is a more slow, embedded long-term work that is a little bit different, but also has the same kind, similar kinds of valencies in some of the sub-projects. So that's quite interesting, and it's also a provocation for us to think about how and in what ways we can make these kinds of propositions to some of the museums that are based here in Cape Town, to have an Institute of Troubles, for example, an interdisciplinary institute based inside Ezekiel, working with these museums. So that's a really wonderful provocation for us to think about, and how to actually do that. Tani?
Yeah, I also just wanted to pick up on what George said about this questioning the investment in cataloging. I think it's a super relevant question on so many levels. So I think two speculative thoughts. One is that I think one of the reasons for this investment is to do with this attempt to shore up the scientificity of collections. And the other, I think it also, at least for the Natural History Museum, it's something to do with reproducibility as a key requirement also of scientificity. What's interesting in this regard is that the museum, as I said, has secured unprecedented money for this digitization. Its motto is "for nature." However, no environmental assessment is being done on the digitization, and I think this is something we could also really question, because we know that there is a huge energy expense, not just the practice of digitizing, but the maintaining of digital assets, a long-term preservation of digital assets.
You can suggest to the Natural History Museum that we would be more than happy to assist them with, since they have this huge budget and we know a little bit about digitizing, that we can assist them with all kinds of ways and means of rethinking the digitization practices to move away from some of the cultures of cataloging that George has mentioned, to cultures of collaboration with the Global South and so on. I'm being a little bit flippant, but I'm also trying to think of a provocation about how and in what ways biodiversity is actually being used by the Natural History Museum. You have this idea of biodiversity from all over the world, using very centralized models and epistemologies of how that biodiversity is actually being thought about. But what kind of global influences of the museum is the museum actually drawing on for diversifying its data practices and data management and data collection? So yeah, you have biodiversity, but you use one model of data collection, data storage, data management, data classification, when there are possible ways of thinking about data diversity, that there are diverse cultures of data accumulation, representation, and practices that could also interface exactly with the diversity of these collections.
Can I ask a question? I was really interested in what George said, and you talked about artists being measured, and I wondered if you could say a bit more what you meant by that. I mean, one of the things that struck me and strikes me in the Berlin example is, I mean, often there's a kind of short-term engagement or contract and so on. And it's really striking that in this case, the museum have got behind people as long-term members of staff and the departmental. And so, I mean, there's something talking about resourcing and funding that's really interesting. But I mean, I wasn't sure, was that in terms of being measured, was that what you were you kind of thinking about, or being kind of rated as members of staff or equivalents, or it's just outside visitors?
I mean, that's a cool question, but I think Pippa was urgent to come in.
Oh, sorry.
No, I wasn't. George, please go on. I was just thinking, that we teach a museum course, and we take a fairly diverse group of students, diverse both in terms of cultural background and also academic interests. and they do you know, a semester in the museum. And what's always interested me is that every natural historian in the museum presents their taxonomies. Taxonomy is the most critical part of their presentation. And what troubles our students most is the particular form of taxonomy, because every one of them comes with another background and a different sense of how to classify and describe a species. And of course, if one historicizes it, then you see all kinds of practices. You know, if you look at, you know, arguments between farmers and those establishing national reserves in Southern Africa, for instance, in the early 20th century, how you classified animals and understood them was critical to whether they survived or were exterminated. And those kinds of classification, I think, are completely absent from our contemporary forms of classifying in museums. And it's really been interesting to me over the years to see how much of a problem this is for new generations of students who are interested in the way museums you know, understand and describe their collections. Sorry, I interrupted.
This question that Chris posed about measuring the artist. Tahani, we are not leaving you out of the conversation. You can also weigh in the question of measuring artists and.
No, but I mean, she put it on the table. It's her trouble that she's made at the moment. But I mean, I think what you put down as artists being in the long term solves the problem in one way. And then I think that's an important intervention, because usually you're forced to come in, make a big impact, and then leave. So if you're now working on the project for 5 years or 2 years, then you've got you don't feel the pressure to make a big statement quickly. So that's one thing that solves the problem. But the other thing is something that Tal we didn't get to the last time, where it was also about the artist being the principal researcher. Because most of the time, even if you've got 5 years, you're still working for somebody else with their deliverables. If so, now we need to get to a point where artists have the same position as lead researcher, with the power to direct the research question and output with the same budget. So it becomes a question of there's always more. And then for me, I don't think it's a position that the artists are the only ones that face, but it's faced by other people in research groups that come in as ancillary. So I don't know, Tahani, what your position is yet, but I get a sense that the data scientist is not as or rather, in my experience, the data scientist is not as central in some cases as the lead researcher who is doing the theory. So for me, it would be interesting to think about how these different, because if you think about the think tanks are always convened by the theorist. What would it mean if the think tank is in this field? You know, in other fields it's different, but in this field it's always the theorist. What would it mean if the data scientist was the one that was driving the whole project? You know, what would it mean for you if you were the head? What would you be making everybody do? What would it mean if the artist was the head? What would the artist be making everybody do? So I think for me, that's the next level of conversation. Once that the term, you know, the long-term issue is made normal. So yeah, but I talk too much and I'm gonna keep quiet.
Thanks for that, George. I think that was really, really important. Tahani, in 2-3 minutes, you want to respond?
Yes, thanks, George. I'm always reminded of this artist group in the UK. I worked on their archive when I was still in London. It was a group called Artist Placement Group. They were active in the 70s and 80s, and what they did was resist a model of artists in residence and come up with this idea of artist placement, where they would place artists for a longer period of times in companies and government offices, not for the artists to make work, but for artists to participate in decision making in these organizations. And that is exactly, I think, something that you mentioned, George, that artists are not just these creative people that come in and then make something beautiful out of what they see, but that they also have a structural impact or epistemic impact. And yes, you're totally right to say that there's, of course, an epistemic hierarchy in the museum. So on top you have hypothesis-driven natural sciences, and then you have the taxonomists and the curators, and then you have the technical and the data staff, and then you have the technical staff. And I'm not sure where we are. We are constantly trying to figure out where to fit in.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Tahani. Thank you so much for beaming in from Berlin. We've reached the end of our session, the second session, and the last session of the Spirals series for 2020. It's been a wonderful kickoff. It's been a wonderful session, super generative. So many different perspectives came up and provocations that I'm sure that we'll pick up in 2021. So I want to thank all of our participants who beamed in today. It's been a long year, a long semester, and it's probably been a long week as well. So to come in on a Friday afternoon, it's absolutely wonderful. Hopefully next year we'll be able to meet in person, but we'll keep you updated as to our sessions. We are recording the session, so anybody who feels uncomfortable about that, or in any way we do not want to be represented, I'm pretty sure we can find ways of muting you out and blurring you out of the recording if you do not feel like you want to be captured. You can send us an email. And yeah, we want to thank you so much and thank Tahani and thank Fritha also for thinking with us and for engaging with Tahani's work and for putting your work on the table also. Much to think with, much to think with. Thank you, everybody, and take very good care.
Thank you, and thank you for putting this together. It's been wonderful 2 sessions. Look forward to next year.
Thanks so much. Stay safe, Tahani. Stay safe in lockdown.
Thanks.
Yeah.
You too. Happy weekend.
Thank you. Bye.
Yes, bye-bye.
Thanks, George.